This is Yesterzine, the monthly magazine show about monthly magazines. We take a magazine from the golden age, play the games they liked most and least, and flip through to find out what gaming was like when games were so good magazines marked out of 1,000. Well, one magazine did. Ace, a magazine we joined in August 1990 with issue 35. Ace was EMAP's multi-format magazine, and it was a weird puppy. EMAP owns CVG, so I never quite understood why Ace existed or who it was for. Perhaps very early on it was a more relaxed magazine. CVG was still printing tie-pins when Ace launched in 1987 after all, but if anything by 1990 CVG had largely crossed over it and was the more arcade magazine. And besides, EMAP bought Ace from Future 22 issues in, so that decision makes even less sense. Ace's eventual fate was even weirder. After issue 55, it was closed and the entire staff moved wholesale to a completely redesigned The One Amiga, arguably starting that magazine's golden era, but also arguably making Ace more accurately early era The One than early era The One was. Our Gaming Heaven is a strategy classic from the genre's master, and the highest scoring game in this show's history. This would be a more impressive accolade if Our Gaming Hell wasn't the second highest scoring game in this show's history. But first, the news from August 1990. The Amiga CD-TV had been announced a month earlier, and Atari had clearly panicked. They promised a version of their competing ST computer with a built-in CD drive during 1991. This, you will be absolutely shocked to know, never happened. I think the machine they allude to is the Mega STE, but that ended up having a floppy drive built in and cost nearly 4 times as much as a standard STE, for a slightly quicker CPU, a small hard drive, and the fact it took up 3 times the desk space. It was, you will be equally shocked to hear, Atari's last ST. Speaking of failure, MGT went out of business this month. Their main product had been the SAM Coupe, an upgrade route for Spectrum owners feeling abandoned by new owners Amstrad. The problem was it was still an 8-bit machine, had half an Amiga's memory, still relied on tape storage in the main, and if you did use a disk, it had a lovely hardware bug where if you forgot to remove said disk before you reset the machine, the disk would become corrupted. Oh, and it wasn't actually properly compatible with the Spectrum. The backwards compatibility only really worked with 48KB titles, and a timing issue broke many things, including the copy protection on a lot of games titles. It's the company that's failed, not the product, said one of the company's founders, which, given they'd sold all of 12,000 of the things in 2 years, does rather beg the question of what they thought failure would actually look like. Nintendo were getting tough with the Game Genie cheat device, no surprise to anyone who was here last episode. Also last episode, we speculated that Nintendo's problem was more with the codies trying to circumvent their copy protection than the cheat device itself. And their slightly pathetic explanation of what they didn't like about the Game Genie rather supports this.
The designers of games spend a long time getting everything right. This is a copyright of infringement.
Which I'm not sure is even technically English. Apparently home VR will be a common reality inside 3 years according to Atari founder Nolan Bushnell. He was only out by a factor of 10 on that timeline. The article says he was currently helping Commodore make a success of their CD-TV, so maybe that explains the delay. And finally, combining CDs, failure, and tremendous hubris, Philips were talking about their imminent CDI, and also a product Yesterzine viewers will be familiar with, the Sony Intelligent Discman, their first console and a portable CDI compatible, which will apparently allow you, in conjunction with that video CD feature, to maybe, in the future, watch your favourite videos on the bus. Imagine that. Philips' statement about the CD-TV in no way came back to haunt them.
They're taking a tremendous risk. It doesn't have FMV and it isn't CDI compatible. And CDI is the standard that most manufacturers of similar equipment will be following.
Nailed it.
The very basics of my childhood gaming are 1986 ZX Spectrum, 1989 PC, 1992 Amiga 500, and from there it opens up pretty quickly to everything. So in this era of Ace, I was very much a PC gamer, and what I played in that era falls very neatly into 3 categories. 1. Sierra Online adventure games. Think Leisure Suit Larry before they ruined it. Think King's Quest. Think Space Quest. Think Quest for Glory. 2. Literally anything with wheels. This was the era of Papyrus's Indy 500, of Test Drive, of Grand Prix Circuit and Lombard RAC Rally. 3. Microprose. Just in general. Pirates was a staple. The first game I remember losing an entire day to was Sid Meier's Civilization. And of course there's Railroad Tycoon, the business sim come digital train set that all but created the genre for most people. And it's this month that Railroad Tycoon storms into the pages of Ace and earns itself a score of 943. Got to be precise about these things. It's definitely more fun than 942, but 944, that's just going too far. We probably shouldn't harp on about this, but the fact Ace somehow imagined they could quantify video game enjoyment on that scale makes less sense every time you think about it. Especially as their related marks were all out of 10. Technically, Ace are reviewing the PC version here, but just for some slight interface improvements and the ease of getting the mouse working properly, we're actually going to play the Amiga version. Compared to a modern Tycoon game, you might find the actual mechanics of Railroad Tycoon pretty simple. Starting in one of 4 eras and locations, the game runs for 100 years of the history of your little railroad company. You build tracks and stations across a fairly simple 2D square grid map, whose simple icons represent the kind of goods that may be supplied and indeed demanded. Passengers and mail are both demanded and supplied by towns, for instance. An oil plant will demand coal to make petroleum, which the towns will consume, and so forth. You buy trains individually and set them on routes that will enable them to make money doing this. Doing the oil plant dance will make you more money, but you can just sell goods to towns and be profitable. The only place you need to be careful, and only then on the harder modes, is signalling. Tracks can be single or double tracked, and if it's single track you can get a crash if you mess up placing signals. In lower modes, passing on single track just costs time, it's assumed the job was done properly. The side game is smaller than in modern titles too. Stations can be improved to attract more passengers or maintain and build engines, for example. But other than upgrading your trains as new ones are released, that's about it for the ongoing maintenance of your network. You get to focus on expanding the empire rather than babysitting what you already have. And you will want to expand, because 3 other AI-run train company owners will be trying to do the same. And with an exception we'll come to, you can't build stations too close to theirs. So in general, the pressure is on to expand quickly, even if the funding might not entirely be there. You're not without tools to mess with them though. You can buy shares in their companies, for instance. With sufficient money, you can end up taking them over completely. Although by the time you're in a position to do this, it's going to be cost prohibitive. Shares in a successful company, the other side of the map, can be a nice little earner though, and it's all profit. You have one more weapon. If you're very close to another competitor, you can build a link straight to one of their stations, and then begins a battle where there's a price war. Halving your revenue, but the company that serves the most tonnage to the station over the period of said war wins control of the station and the area, with the opposing company forced to vacate. Late game, this can be your only method to expand. On the lower modes, you can't be attacked in this way, although the trade-off is you can only own shares in one of your 3 competitors. In the highest modes, they can do it all to you as well, including buying a controlling interest out from under you. I don't play on those. To a degree, these games out-evolved me. There's only so much I want to keep track of. With SimCity, traffic and power were enough. I don't need to worry about buses, water, subways, telephone cables, or whatever else the city's skylines throws at you. Building with a little light financial war suits me just fine, and I lost weeks to this one as a child. It's not perfect. The interface by today's standards actively hates you. Take a look at this screen, for instance. Looks like a standard mouse pointer interface, but for reasons I'm sure made sense in some design meeting, you actually right-click menus to activate them, or press the highlighted letter. You still left-click to select an item in the menu though, because of course you do. The keyboard functions are finicky. Amiga 600 owners look away, because laying track involves using the number pad. Specifically, the number pad with numlock switched on. And it'll only lay track if you hold down shift as well. And just to confuse you further, doubling the track is Shift and D, because of course D opens one of the menus. Couldn't have used, say, Alt at least to immediately lay double track maybe? The 4 variously zoomed in views as well cry out for something in the middle quite a lot of the time. You get used to it all of course, and the whole thing generally works. But for a game with such simple mechanics, it's a little too often a barrier between you and getting things done that seems more a design barrier than a technical one. But once you do, you absolutely realise why so much of my life disappeared into a Sid Meier-shaped hole. In 2021, the concept of a tycoon game is pretty familiar. Planet Zoo and Coaster, for instance, from Frontier, developed off Railroad Tycoon and allowing you to build zoo and theme park empires respectively. More directly, of course, the theme park and theme hospital games are very much inspired by this, leading to the recent release of 2 Point Hospital. And there's any number of more macro-scale building games like Tropico Settlers and Banished that trace their lineage here. Just to try and sell that lineage, Planet Coaster by Frontier is a development of their own later Roller Coaster Tycoon games back when they were published by Atari. Atari took over the publishing of those games from Infogram, who purchased Hasbro, who were the purchasers in turn of Microprose. Frontier took over as developers from the original creator Chris Sawyer, who in 1994 created Transport Tycoon for Microprose. Which is really just to try and convince you of a sense of how momentous this game was. You could argue SimCity got there first to a degree, but SimCity is mostly about zoning and letting the AI actually do the building. There's a directness to Railroad Tycoon that I tend to find more satisfying. It's very much the itch that would later be scratched by games like Minecraft, or even Roblox. There's much more of a sense of creation here, and the somewhat more simple mechanics of RRT, especially in my preferred modes, really make the sense of relaxed building of something that works shine through. Actually, I think I've nailed it there for the younger viewers. These games were, and to an extent still are, our childhood Minecraft. Modern Sims are much more complex, much more clever, allow you to do a lot more. But I think something like Cities Skylines or even Tropico 6 are a very different beast. Almost the difference between Minecraft and a serious business house building simulator. In 2021, Railroad Tycoon requires some learning of an interface that's very much the product of trying to design something mostly mouse-driven 3 years before even Windows 3.1 brought mouse control to the PC mainstream. But once you do, and especially in a world where you can quite happily background it when you need to, Railroad Tycoon has changed from being a full fat high strategy game to something of a stress-relieving desktop toy of an experience. I booted this up for the first time in a long time for this, and immediately lost 3 hours without even thinking to do anything as useful as capture any video or take notes. And in 33 episodes of this series, that one's a first. It's not quite the experience it was designed to be 31 years after its release, but Railroad Tycoon is absolutely as good as it ever was. It might even be worth 945 now. In the late 80s, computer machines generally didn't come with what you'd call a controller. You generally bought your own, and generally, it was a joystick. These joysticks often look quite distinctive, and in some cases are nearly as iconic as the machine you plugged them into. For me, that answer is simple. The Quickshot Python. Virtually everything I did on Amiga used one of these puppies, or I guess snakes? The beauty of the era though is that your answer could be entirely distinct and just as valid. Your weapon of choice could easily be the Cheetah 125 or even the Bug. The absolute classic that is the Competition Pro was the most popular choice of the era, and I absolutely guarantee there are now people watching this yelling a variety of other names and models at the screen. And one of those things being yelled might be Konic's Speed King, a design you're not going to forget anytime soon, but even as they were making this, Konic's ambitions were somewhat higher. In the late 80s, they started to design the logical endpoint of the joystick, a configurable multi-controller that could be many other controllers. You could have had attachments for planes, cars, motorbikes, or anything that could be controlled in that fashion. The plan was that this thing got released for a bunch of systems, perhaps convincing some game makers to put specific support in. Imagine this thing on an Amiga, for instance. You could replicate the arcade controllers of Outrun, Super Hang-On, and Afterburner with this thing. I'd have killed for that when I got an Amiga in 1992. I quite like it on my Master System now, come to think of it. But it wasn't available when I got an Amiga in 1992, or indeed, ever. And depending on how kind you want to read the situation, it's because Konitz got ambitious, or because they got greedy. They decided to make it into a console. I framed the Sam Coupe screenshots carefully earlier, because the article here in issue 35 in August 1990 shares space with one about the Konitz, and it's not optimistic. To find out how we got here though, we go back a couple of years to Ace issue 10, when it was still a Future Publishing magazine. Nestled in the back of that issue is a story of a forthcoming new computer from a company called Flair, which, like MGT, creators of the Sam Coupe, was founded by ex-Sinclair engineers. The Flair 1 sounded weirdly unbalanced, to tell you the truth. A music and graphics-based machine taking aim squarely at the Amiga and ST, it had 768 kilobytes of RAM, beating both at the time, 256 colours on screen, beating both at the time, and full stereo sound with 8 voices, again beating both at the time. But it was still going to use the same 8-bit Z80 processor as the Spectrum, and several of that machine's contemporaries. They claimed their reliance on custom chips would allow them to bridge the gap, and indeed this is how the Super Nintendo works and produces the incredible visuals for the time that machine is capable of. The trouble is, that's also how the Amiga works. The article talks up the potential but admits it's short on actual detail. A further report is promised for issue 11, and it's a good thing I've got a full digital set of Ace here, isn't it? That promise is fulfilled. The Flair 1 makes the cover, or rather its engineers do, in order to point out their Z80 is at least a lot quicker than the one in existing machines. But really, the technical discussion just serves to prove that by having a hybrid 8 and 16-bit machine, what they've actually produced is something remarkably complex and possibly over-designed. The article even admits to some downsides. The machine cannot do an 80-column text screen, so that's text-based serious uses down the Swanee immediately. And they're even still talking about having a tape loading option, which would take a very, very long time if you're going to be filling that generous memory. Flair also admit they could never manufacture the thing themselves, with Amstrad reported to be the frontrunner for a tie-up, presumably to fill the slot that would eventually become the CPC Plus range. The nuke they want to drop, though, is the price. The Amiga 500 and ST-FM were £400 machines at this point. The well ahead of its time Archimedes was double that. Flair thought they could get this one to market for £200, a price much more akin to that of a Spectrum Plus 3 in 1988. Although how they could know this without a manufacturing partner is something it's very easy to be cynical about. As you'll probably know though, Amstrad never made this machine. Instead, in 1990, launching a range of mildly facelifted CPCs with a cartridge slot. But 7 months later, Flair re-emerged as the provider of the internals of the now full console Konix multi-system. The front cover goes in hard, and so does the magazine, with 6 pages of a feature that is almost advertorially bullshit. The price is still £200, despite now having to come complete with a very elaborate controller. Predictably, it's also had a processor upgrade, now using an Intel 8086 16-bit heart and combining the myriad of custom chips into a cheaper, simple, single piece of silicon. And we get a lot more pictures of what the thing would actually look like. And well, to be honest, what it looks like is something that should have a Fisher-Price logo, 6 sound effects and be a tenner in Argos. The cassette option has gone, and this is a solid 3.5-inch disc affair, which could potentially load the entire game into memory on startup. Discs, rather than carts, should keep game prices down to about £15, comparable to the 8-bit disc game prices, lower than the Amiga, and obviously much lower than the likes of the Master System and the Nintendo ES. Peripherals were touted in the form of a pedal unit for driving games, and even a dedicated chair, a concept a quarter century ahead of its time. All ready for a blowout 100,000 unit launch in August 1989, which of course you know does not happen. October, and issue 25 arrives. Ace is now with EMAP, and has its hands on what it claims is a retail multi-system unit. The article is heavy on telling us things we already know. For instance, explaining the controller side of things, although does introduce Ace's first note of caution. If you want 2-player, you're going to need 2 machines to be connected together. The slave machine doesn't need power, but that's not going to stop it costing £200, and the concept of being able to use the machine as a controller for your Amiga or Master System has been disposed of. Probably because all that would do is stop you buying multi-system games. And there were games. 24 in total have some evidence of being in development, and it included games in the Crazy Cars, Last Ninja and Starglider series. Notably, there's a lack of what you might call system sellers, and if I'm honest, a slight lack of games that would actually use the unique controller in any meaningful way. There's no helicopter game on the list, and only one bike game, interestingly by Argonaut, who would later perform miracles on both the Game Boy and SNES in the realm of 3D. It also reveals the first holes in the hardware claims. ConnexMultisystem.co.uk talked to Chris Walsh from Argonaut about the machine.
It wasn't really cut out for that type of game. The road itself was drawn in software, and the amount of lines of road on the screen directly dictated the frame rate. It just wasn't really quick enough to do more than that without slowing down.
And Chris would know, because he was there at the time, talking in this very article about how polygon-based the machine was.
Polygon games like Starglider 2 are going to be very easy to program. It's as though the designers of the machine were obsessed with producing something that could shift polygons quickly.
Which does beg the question of why Argonaut decided to make a sprite-based bike game. That said, Dave Collier, lead programmer on Daley Thompson's Decathlon, has similar thoughts, also talking to ConnexMultisystem.co.uk.
I found it tedious to get any sort of speed unless I used the hardware of Lit Engine. We gave up on it due to time to market, I think. From what I remember, it was not very good at anything.
Ace offers a theory on this one. The ASIC, essentially that bundled custom chip, was being relied on heavily. The 8086, while technically 16-bit, was also getting on a bit at the time, and this reliance meant even upbeat Ace theorised you'd find yourself using 16 of the available 256 colours and half the possible sound channels just to keep the speed up, as well as restricting yourself to an actually tiny 50 polygons a frame. The price had wobbled too. The upper limit of £200 was now a tad over £200, and the machine was now due for Christmas. It didn't happen. December's issue of the Games Machine has the story in progress. The machine is now a post-Christmas release. Employees are openly saying the company is on the verge of going under. Certainly, the fact all software development has been suspended pending finalised hardware specs is worrying. And if you didn't have finalised hardware specs when you're claiming you can have 100,000 units on the shelves a month later, you are very lying about something. We also know by this point Connex had sold their joystick business to Spectra Video, the owners of the Quickshot brand. The multi-system is now an all or nothing affair for them. It was clearly nothing. The world goes silent for 8 months and we get back to Ace issue 35. There's been a management buyout at Connex, and System 3 have a finished version of Last Ninja 2, but nothing to release it on. The other games are still suspended. Connex aren't returning phone calls, and Ace points out a bunch of machines have been released around the world in that time, including notably the Sega Mega Drive and Super Nintendo. Connex founder Wyn Holloway, again talking to ConnexMultisystem.co.uk, effectively claims a conspiracy.
What you've got to remember is that the Japanese were very powerful. One of the top banking groups are bought out by a large Japanese company, so they disappeared. Another backer said, "Sorry Wyn, gonna have to withdraw. We have too many Japanese customers."
I'm not convinced. But certainly Wyn is remarkably open about how he saw the whole situation, so I'd recommend checking out the interview for yourself. The story isn't over though. The remains of Connex did flog the multi-system, in part to be made as a PC controller in China. There were even rumours of a Connex 2, which also never saw the light of day. Fool us once. The interesting story though is on Flair's side, because there was a Flair 2. It was also designed as a computer but became a console. It was also a machine with a low-end CPU for its day, the 16-bit 68000 from the Amiga, but which relied on custom chips to enable its full power, and sell its claim to be a 64-bit machine. Some of you have worked out where this is going. The Flare 2 was bought by Atari, and with more development, this one was released. And the Atari Jaguar was, well, also a complete failure that took down its host company, if we're being honest. But one that not only is still loved by many, but also the machine that came the closest to delivering Ace's prediction of home VR than anything else before the appearance of Oculus and HTC Vive on PC and PS4 VR nearly 25 years later. And that's not the only outcome. Remember Argonaut talking about Starglider on the Conix and how much it'd be easy with the polygon capabilities? And remember how I said Argonaut did big things with polygons on the SNES? Because there is a fair chance you've played what Starglider became. Because ex-Flare employees went to work for Argonaut. They helped create the Super FX chip, and that Starglider game, well, you've already seen it in this section, because it became this. We send huge tips of the hat to conixmultisystem.co.uk, which tells this story in massively more detail than we are, and contains all the background information on the machine and the planned games that you could ever want. You have to love a site run by an obsessive, and this is certainly that. Do go visit. I would also like to acknowledge Craig Vaughan's article on the Conix from issue 8 of Retro Gamer, for possibly being the definitive single work on the subject. I would urge you to hunt it down. We, though, have a game to play.
Accolade presents...
Accolade were for a time the kings of driving games. In partnership with Distinctive Software Inc., I did an entire documentary series essentially on the subject. The short version of that for now is that at the start of talking about Railroad Tycoon, I mentioned 4 driving games. 2 of those were from the combination of Accolade and DSi. This is where the long-running Test Drive series appeared. Without DSi, Accolade still pushed out a credible third entry in the Test Drive series, and one of the very few Formula 1 games with a track editor in Grand Prix Unlimited. But here, we have an Accolade driving game I've not played. Or heard of. And it's the lowest scorer in this issue. Granted, the 64% it gets if we decode the scoring system is still very high for a lowest scorer in anything but peak lazy era Amiga action. So I think we need to investigate Heat Wave Offshore Superboat Racing, known in the UK as the even more unwieldy Powerboat USA Offshore Superboat Racing. Because why name just one kind of boat in your title? The back of the box is trying hard. Race a $1 million superboat through 3D courses. Which is interesting because the UK box art says they're only $230,000 superboats. Clearly those American customs fees are very nearly as much as trying to order an analog SG through FedEx. However much they cost, the rest of the blurb is mostly taken straight from your mum's Tinder profile. 7-ton 50-foot monster. Hull's 38 times stronger than steel. 3,200 horsepowers. 100 miles an hour. Computer opponents. Race on oceans, rivers and canals. Different weather conditions. And, onboard repairs. Okay, they can't all be winners, but it's certainly talking a good game. One thing that does occur immediately though is, this is all very ambitious. Rendering all that course variety on a 286 or Amiga? The talk about realistic wave and wake physics? I don't want to prejudge anything, but this game has a copyright of 1989. I loved Grand Prix Circuit, but it was also released in 1989 and you're watching it now. Does this look like a level of quality that's going to support wave physics being sold harder than 1997 Silicon Graphics-backed Wave Race on the N64? One way to find out, I guess. Let's boot up the PC version. And this is not the first time I've done this, so just trust me when I just ease the volume down a bit for you. That is an intro. And no, it doesn't support anything other than the PC bleeper. which even in 1990 was a little unusual for a full-price PC game, and Ace even comment on that in their review. We mostly played the Amiga version of Railroad Tycoon, of course, but despite having approximately 2 sounds in the entire game, the PC one supported several sound cards. The menus are a little confusing. They've tried to theme it alongside the sport, but really the side effect of that is you end up confused as to what half the options mean. The box and menu very much give the impression they want to give a Miami Vice theme to the thing, and that's not an accident. The design verges on the legally distinct at times, and the star of that show, Don Johnson, was a successful powerboat racer himself, lending his name to one of the boats. None of which cost $1 million, so there's the American box exposed as the liar of the pair. We go for a test lap, and the controls are a little weird, requiring you to use plus and minus for throttle, but actual navigation is pretty easy. You can see the boys from a decent distance given the resolution, and moving to check the map is a thing the game is kind enough to pause during, so you can map your route. It's quite a pleasant little jaunt, really. What it's not so far is any kind of thrill ride. I feel I'm going for more of a pleasure cruise than skipping over the waves at 100 miles an hour, and understandably the scenery is not going to be the joy here. Still, maybe it'll transform as a racing game, so we go for qualifying. And we can't get close. At all. Qualifying is a simple matter of steaming off to a marker and back. In the time provided, we can't even reach the marker, even when I try a different circuit. There's not a lot of this game on YouTube, but what there is made something very clear. My game isn't running right. Everyone else's seems to be a lot faster, despite my copy indicating my top speed is correct. Rather than try and diagnose this in DOSBox, I pull my Railroad Tycoon trick and decide to try it out on an Amiga. On the plus side, at least that intro is going to be a lot easier on the ears. Or maybe not. The difference though is instant, and qualify we do. The difference in perceived speed transforms the game as well. We leap off into a race, and this is more like it. There is now a genuine sense of speed in the thing. I discovered in qualifying it's actually possible to spin a boat, which I'd never considered a thing before. So now what we have here is a surprisingly interesting and quite unique driving game. But do we have a racing game? Not really, and there's a few reasons why. I actually don't know if it's realistic, but you can't run these engines wide open, it seems. They overheat and eventually blow up, requiring some running repairs, which cost us a penalty. That's actually a big problem, because at what seems to be the best speed I can keep up all the time, there's actually no problem getting around any of the turns on the course. So other than pushing it a little on the straights and backing off, you've just removed the driving part from the equation. I don't need to change speed on the whole course, really. And I'll get round about as fast as it's possible to do so. And surprisingly then, in a 2-lap race, we all finish in pretty much the same time, and it turns out the AI picked up a few penalties too. If I'd done the entire race at a safe speed and not picked up that penalty, I would easily have won. So your entire success in this game in terms of racing the AI can depend on whether the game decides they did a naughty, and not at all in the land of your own skills. That is a problem. And it's a shame really, because it kind of blows up the racing side of the whole thing. And speaking of blowing up, that's the other problem. The slightest love tap between these boats, however so caused, makes your own instantly explode. And with only a dodgy radar to rely on, that is a surprisingly easy thing to do. So you have to socially distance yourself and never really get involved in dicing for position. Still, I see what they were trying to do here. It feels quite a lot like one of those modern X-simulator games. Euro Truck, lawnmower, farming, etc. that very much rely on doing things properly. And in that vein, it's not unsuccessful. But equally, the thing is pitched as a thrill-a-minute driving game, and between the overheating and the insta-death for a single rub, then you really cannot play it that way. It's not a total loss, and it does seem to me the 65% it got is a genuine one. And it's unlucky to be the worst game, rather than Ace being the kind of magazine that just used 650 to 1000 as their marking scale. But much like Railroad Tycoon, it's not, especially now, the kind of game it pretends to be. And, much like Railroad Tycoon, the discerning 2021 Yesterzine viewer should play the Amiga version, not the PC one. But also, much like Railroad Tycoon, there is genuinely something to look at here, if only fairly briefly before the sheer thinness of the racing element takes effect. On the back page this month is Dave, better known as the host of Zylog and Moto. Dave's mission is simple. He is going to bring his light conversational style to looking at a different 8 or 16-bit Sega game every week, until he has done all of them. And he might just get there, because he's recently stormed through 2 straight years of weekly episodes and shows no sign of slowing down. At the risk of giving away how I'm actually working in advance for once, at the time of writing his last 4 have been Joe Montana Football 2, Street Racer, Star Wars Chess, and the Master System classic Bomber Raid. They're usually a relaxed 20 minutes and eminently suitable for winding down after a hard day or a powerboat race. And off I go to wind down. I've not seen that Joe Montana episode yet after all, and while you're subscribing to Zylog, do the same here if you haven't already, and then just click every button in sight and maybe YouTube will get the hint. Sayonara!